So this presentation is all going to be about the sustainability and economics of community news in the UK. My name is Dr. Andy Williams, and this is something I research where I work at the Cardiff University School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies. Now, before I tell you what I found in this research project, I think it would be useful to tell you a little bit about the state of mainstream professional local news in the UK beforehand. Now, the main place where local news gets produced in this country is in commercial local newspapers, and they're in big trouble. There's a report from the think tank and campaigning group, the Media Standards Trust, recently outlined. They told us that local newspapers in the UK are in crisis. The funding model for the local press has collapsed. It's apocalyptic talk, but it's true. In the 5 years between 2005 and 2010, the revenue of the four leading local newspaper companies in the UK dropped between a quarter and half. This is a big thing. In South Wales, the number of editorial and production staff at Media Wales dropped from almost 700 in 1999 to 136 in 2010. This is my local patch, so it's something that I know about in 2015, where we stand at the moment. It's around about the 100 mark. So there are lots of journalists being lost as a consequence of the crisis in the business model of local news. That figure from Media Wales in South Wales comes from my own research, actually, into the mainstream local newspaper industry here. And the consequences of such huge cuts to journalism workforces are really grave. These developments have impacted on the quality, on the independence of local news that we read in this country. And the knock-on effects for the strength of local democracy could be huge. So you can see how this bigger picture is part of the reason why it's important to understand community and hyperlocal news much better than we already do. If the UK is facing a crisis in the provision of important local news and information to people, we need to understand what's replacing it and whether these new players like community journalists, like hyperlocal news producers, can adequately sustain themselves so that vital democratic functions of news can continue into the future. So what did we do? Well, in this study, I did a very detailed 11-day snapshot content analysis of over 300 sites. Almost 4,000 posts were analyzed. But in this presentation, I'll focus more on an online survey we did with 183 community news producers, the biggest of its kind in the UK, perhaps the world, looking at resources and sustainability, among other things. And we'll also be focusing on some of the results from a series of semi-structured interviews that we did with 36 community news producers in the UK, covering similar topics to the survey. What do we find? What do we find with these research methods? Well, firstly, who produces this kind of community news? How do they describe what they do? Our survey yielded some interesting results for us in this regard. The UK hyperlocal news sector is now reasonably well established and dominated by players who've achieved a degree of longevity. Nearly 3/4 of our survey sample have been producing news for over 3 years, around a third for more than 5 years. We found that 7 out of 10 producers see what they do as a form of active community participation. So lots and lots of them see this as active work in the community. Over half see it as local journalism, plain and simple. And again, over half see it as an expression of active citizenship. So more than half linking it to active citizenship work that they're doing. Almost half of our participants actually have some kind of journalistic training or experience working in the mainstream media. This isn't a mythic group of armchair auditors or citizen journalists pure. These findings suggest that community news producers are fairly evenly split between amateurs with very little experience and professionals or semi-professionals with direct training or experience. Given the declining revenues of Britain's local press, lots of people argue, quite rightly I think, that economic sustainability will be a vital issue for new local news ventures. Local news takes time and effort and money to produce and circulate, even if the barriers to entry in this regard are low, and even if, as is the case for a lot of hyperlocal news in the UK, these things, time, effort, money, are often given freely by volunteers. Now, we tried to quantify this effort by asking participants how many hours are worked in any given week on their sites by everyone who contributes. And that's the people who run it, but also people who contribute irregularly or just a little bit. And 4 out of 10 are the product of relatively few hours worked, 10 hours or less. The rest are more time consuming, with a third demanding between 21 and 50 hours work, and a quarter demanding more than 50 hours work overall. When it comes to the individual producers, who are the main engines behind these sites, almost 60% work up to 10 hours a week, and 26% work between 11 and 30 hours. But a minority work full-time, with 11% putting in a more than 40-hour week on their hyperlocal site. It's a lot of work. How is this labour funded? Well, around a third of our survey participants, they make money. Mostly quite modest amounts, but around a third make money. 12% say they make less than £100 a month, for instance, but 13% on the other end of the spectrum say they generate more than £500 a month. Most community news producers fund the running costs of their sites from their own pockets, but around 1 in 4, around a quarter, raise enough money to cover their own costs from revenues generated by the news service that they're running. Advertising is the dominant form of income generation, but a number of other methods are often employed, often in a very mixed way. So they won't rely just on advertising. There'll be advertising and one of a number of different funding options. Some receive grant funding from charities or charitable trusts. Some are employing native advertising or advertising features, advertorials. Donations or subscriptions are a part of the funding mix for some, and there's a minority of now free of new free printed newspapers being put out by some people in the UK as well, because the advertising yield is bigger when there are more eyeballs on your ads, of course. Despite the low proportion of economically successful community news producers, not many of these are very successful economically, and by most people's standards, I think. But despite this, 9 out of 10 still think that they can sustain or increase current levels of output in the coming year. So indications that it might not all be about the money, after all. Alongside what I've said is, a lot of good news. Some notes of caution now. Okay, there's a lot to be encouraged about in our research findings as a whole, but when we looked at the economics, we couldn't help be struck by numerous indications of the precarious nature of many community news operations. Professional and personal circumstances change. These changes often impact upon the time available for community news projects. And because so many are dependent on individuals or very small editorial teams, there's no guarantee that a news outlet will survive the loss of a key contributor. Lots of them said things like, if I were run over by a bus tomorrow, then the site would go with me. I'm currently thinking through the likely effects of the deinstitutionalization and deprofessionalization of news, which a lot of community journalism like this represents. Some people argue that the widespread voluntarism, the fact that many of these sites are produced by volunteers, this voluntarism may be enough to sustain community news into the future, as it does in other spheres of UK public life. So the justice system, parts of it, local and community politics, school governance, all sustained very nicely, in part at least, by volunteers. Others, though, worry that without revenues and more importantly, the profits needed to pay people for the work that they're doing, the sector will be too precarious to sustain the kinds of institutions which have previously been necessary prerequisites, really, for a strong, independent and critical local news. So, for example, in terms of the financial and institutional backing and support available to them, hyperlocals are often left on their own. So if they want to be critical of a powerful local institution, they have to do so without the backing of a newspaper company lawyer, for example. And these things are potentially serious worries, I think. Um, Another note of caution, an important element of what we did overall involved trying to produce findings which allow us to compare the value of this emergent cultural form, hyperlocal news, with that of the arguably still dominant output of commercial local newspaper providers. Now, we've seen in many respects the comparisons are quite favorable, especially when you look at the content of hyperlocal news, which is stuff that we've looked at elsewhere. But if this comparison between hyperlocal and the mainstream sector is to be a valid one, we also need to try and put our findings on resources and sustainability into some kind of perspective. And this can be done in a very crude form by comparing the numbers of new hyperlocal news producers with the numbers of redundant journalists in an area. Okay, go back to that traditional newspaper industry in my local area, Cardiff and the surrounding valleys. In 1999, remember that quote from the very beginning, the company was employing 700 editorial and production staff. By 2015, this figure had shrunk closer to 100. And this isn't an isolated incident. Now, in that same patch, that same geographic patch, the Centre for Community Journalism at Cardiff University, with whom I work, has found 25 hyperlocal news operations, and these are staffed by around 50 community news producers, the vast majority of them working for no pay on a part-time basis. So in terms of the numbers of news producers that have been lost and that are emerging, and the amount of time that they can spend on news production, hyperlocal is only very partially able to plug the growing news holes in some of the places, some places in the UK. So to sum up, in terms of economic sustainability, there's a lot to celebrate. We got a relatively small group of local news entrepreneurs experimenting with hyperlocal news as a commercial venture, principally using online advertising, but usually as a part of a mixture of funding streams. Some are increasingly turning to free print newspaper models to guarantee a bigger audience for their ads. And then there's a new generation of online community journalists who provide a necessary and valuable service to their communities on a voluntary basis, who enjoy what they do and who are looking forward to carrying on into the near future with some confidence. We should remember this is a cultural form that's rich in social and civic and community value, but generally low in economic value, which means the medium to long-term security of the sector, as well as its editorial independence and its freedom to be critical, may be endangered in the future. If you'd like to find out more about the research, you can download this free open access report that we put together to tell everybody what we found in our survey of community journalists. You can go to the link and get that there. The research was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Board in the UK as part of the Media Community and the Creative Citizen Project and the Media Power and Plurality Project. I'd like to thank very much my research collaborators who were involved with doing the research that you've been hearing about today along with me. Thank you very much.